Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mary-Kate Collins, and I'm the Brussels Director with the Counter Extremism Project. Today's webinar on disinformation, conspiracy theories, and solutions without censorship is brought to you by the Counter Extremism Project and very kindly hosted by Lord Walney. So thank you, Lord Walney, for participating in this today. The Counter Extremism Project is a non-for-profit, non-partisan international policy organisation formed to combat the growing threat from extremist ideologies. Lord Walney, John Woodcock, is kindly hosting today's virtual roundtable, which will explore the debates surrounding disinformation and conspiracy theories. Lord Walney, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is the UK government's independent advisor on political violence and disruption and sits as a non-aligned peer in the House of Lords. So today we'll gather perspectives from academia, journalism, and subject matter experts. Our speakers will go back to basics in exploring the popular myths, realities, assertions, and assumptions when it comes to our information environment, particularly online. Our speakers are Liam Duffy, Strategic Advisor for the Counter Extremism Project, Naama Cates, host of critically acclaimed Incel podcast, Dr. David Jeffery, lecturer in British politics, populism, and local government at Liverpool University, and Aaron Siberium, staff writer at the Washington Free Beacon. So I hope you have an interesting discussion, and please feel free to submit questions through the Q&A function on your screens. Over to you, Lord Walney.
Thanks so much, Mary-Kate. Thank you all. Thank you all for tuning into this, and for the speakers for agreeing to take part and bring their expertise to this really important and very topical subject. I was delighted when talking to Liam actually originally then we were discussing your interest in the Counter Extremism Project's interest in putting on an event like this, and it really chimes with the review which I'm undertaking at the moment for the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary on political violence on the domestic far right and the extremes of the far left in the UK, and many of the international examples of where political violence is manifesting itself amongst our allies, and the different tactics strategies which are being used to deal with it. The discussion over disinformation has really ratcheted up. It ratcheted up, I think, before the 6th of January attacks, but it is massive, obviously, in the States. I'm really pleased we've got people joining us from over in the States today, but also, of course, we are all looking at that debate and looking at the implications here, and so I'm going to shut up very, very soon, because I really want to hear the perspectives of the people that we've brought together. But I'm acutely aware of I suppose being pulled in different directions on this. On the one hand, you see the horrific violence on 6th of January in Capitol Hill, and the fact that directly preceding that and in the period after, you have a huge, a very sizable minority, but 40% of Americans who were saying that the US election had been rigged, despite the total lack of evidence for that, and the correlation between that that misunderstanding, willful or otherwise, and the violence which occurred is obviously a hugely important apposite issue. And I'm conscious of having been part of the domestic political debate on the left and the centre left in the UK, some pretty extraordinary warping of information that can happen within any domestic political debate. But I'm also I'm coming from the perspective of saying, well, look, I mean, this is really important, this is really serious, we need to think about doing something about this, and looking at the way that hostile states can be involved in shaping domestic political discourse. But then also I think, and where I think I'm going to really value the perspectives that you're bringing to the table today, acutely aware of how that can very quickly lead us into a discussion about what views should be banned, and then very quickly in just a discussion which is dominated by basically how to ban various points of view, and losing sight of, now hang on a minute, being part of a liberal democracy, where does freedom of speech sit in all of that? So I do not have the answers on this, but I'm aware that it is a hugely important question, and one in which could be being morphed into unhelpful spaces in this current dynamic. So please, over the course of these next 55 minutes, if you could all set me right on this, that would be that would be excellent. What I'll do is we'll bring in the speakers to say a few introductory remarks, and then let's have as much time as we can kicking this around amongst ourselves. If people who are who've tuned in to this debate live on Zoom want to make a contribution, ask a question, please do so via the Q&A function, and we will try to get to that. But very much enough from me. Leah, why don't you kick off with your some introductory thoughts on this, and then we'll pass it around.
Sure. No, thanks for the intro, and thanks for hosting this. I mean, you talked about going back and forth and setting you right. I don't think anyone here is going to claim to be able to set anybody right on this or to have the final answers on it. But I think what I'm really grateful for you and for CEP in letting us do is actually getting together a bunch of kind of dissenters and skeptics from that prevailing wisdom that you described. And I think I am uncomfortable with a lot of the prevailing wisdom that you described, which is that there is a kind of impulse that the first thing we need to do is ban or censor on this, rather than exploring any other options. So yeah, rather than all the other things we can do upstream or downstream, or however you want to put it, it seems like a lot of the conversation is who needs to be knocked offline and when do they need to be knocked offline and what for. So I think we're in danger of heading towards a very dangerous path, and so I think that's what today is about, is actually taking a step back from that and actually asking what are the questions that we need to answer here, because there are a lot of assertions and assumptions that are bandied around this topic. And if I think about all the conferences and roundtables and headlines and media coverage, you often hear things like we live in an age of disinformation or an age of conspiracy theories, or there was a New York Times headline that said we're living in a crisis of reality. And these are quite bold claims that imply that there needs to be some really urgent action. But actually, there's an absence of evidence around that. Are we really living in an age of disinformation or conspiracy? I'm not sure those fundamental questions have been answered properly. Mm-hmm. We may well be. Disinformation, conspiracy theories may well be a more severe problem than they were a few decades ago. But I'm not sure there was this kind of golden age of reality and truth that we were all attached to, and suddenly we've departed from that, and it's dangerous. So I think what's happening is, the most worrying part, I'll speak mainly from the extremism field, broadly conceived, and I am speaking for myself here, not on behalf of CEP. But CEP has obviously been one of the organizations really calling for terrorist content online to be more robustly handled, and to have a quicker response time in removing that kind of stuff. But there's this whole question about what happens with information that falls short of that terrorist threshold. And a lot of the discourse and a lot of the expertise, in my view, is getting really entangled with broader cultural and political trends. And obviously you mentioned some of them. I mean, the most obvious starting point is the kind of populist backlashes, if you will, that we've seen across the West. So the most obvious examples of that are Brexit and Trump. You've had the Gilets jaunes, you've had other kind of outsider parties across Europe. And I think what's happened is, we know that states like Russia were trying to interfere and influence opinion. But what we've seen is, instead of kind of soul searching or introspection on the part of kind of, dare I say it, centrist liberals or the center ground, there's been a kind of narrative that these political trends have only happened because of Russian disinformation, or they've only happened because of a rising tide of fascism. And I think as a result of that, there's this kind of there's this broader panic that's wrapped up in this kind of alibi for political failure, if I can be really provocative and really challenging. I have no bones in this because I didn't vote in the referendum and don't have a particular say on it. And I know you're raising your eyebrows. I was out of the country in my defense. But I think what's happened is this has brought on a really kind of misanthropic and authoritarian impulse where we don't trust people to communicate in a way that isn't managed by experts. And especially since you said like the January 6th events, that was this utter spectacle and circus of derangement and insanity. But what's happened since then is that it's kind of been an I told you so moment. It's, all these populist backlashes were really just the result of feverish conspiracies or white supremacy in the first place. So, I don't think that's helpful. I don't think it's helpful to say that 63 million people voted for Trump in 2016 because they're all white supremacists or they're all believing conspiracy theories. And the other problem that we've seen emerge from that is this, especially since the emergence of QAnon, you've seen this kind of blurring of the lines between these segments of the population. So there's this idea that I've heard people talk about mass radicalization and we need mass de-radicalization. Like, first of all, that confuses all Trump voters with people who believe in QAnon. And second of all, that confuses everybody who believes in QAnon in either whole or in part with somebody who's on the verge of violence. If we take radicalization to mean what Peter Neumann meant it to mean a few years ago, which was what happens before the bomb goes off, this shouldn't really need to be said, but believing in conspiracy theories doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to commit an act of violence for politics. It doesn't mean you're going to kill for politics. So I think we really need to reestablish those lines quite urgently. And we've seen really, really hysterical and over the top calls, like to knock Fox News off air, after January the 6th, to label or prescribe the Republican Party as a domestic terror cell. And I know we're focused on the UK, but we can't really escape what's happening in the US in that respect. And that has had an impact in the UK as well, because we see even fairly mainstream commentators like Matthew Goodwin or Paul Embry and David Goodhart, people who talk about Brexit and the kind of things that appeal to working class communities, are accused of mainstreaming the far right or flirting with the Great Replacement theory for talking about immigration policy. So there's this huge conflation that I'm really, really worried about, of all these different things that are getting all mixed up and helplessly entangled because of the broader cultural trends. So if I can just kind of conclude what I'm trying to get at, really, is I think maybe we are in an environment of disinformation, but we're also in an environment of really high distrust. And I think that distrust is causing an opening for these conspiracy theories and these kind of emergence of these mimetic ideologies, if you will, all these new kind of narratives and belief systems that are emerging that are weird and wacky and wonderful. But again, I think a lot of it does come back to massive distrust between groups and between people, hierarchical groups in society. And I think by immediately turning to the tools of censorship and knocking people offline, then that distrust is only going to increase, and that kind of animosity between groups is only going to increase. So I think we're risking, we saw the populist backlashes in 2016. We try and suppress that some more. It's like you thought Trump was bad. Wait for the replacement, or we'll wait for the sequel. I think we're really playing with fire here in trying to suppress concerns and discontent that is all being labeled as white supremacy or the result of disinformation and conspiracies. And I guess finally, what I'd say is there is an element of this which is to do with cultural power and cultural influence. And it seems that there's an idea that misinformation and conspiracies only flows one way, as in that's something that the right does. But I would personally say, as a unbothered observer of all of this, that there's plenty that you could call misinformation and conspiracy theories across the political spectrum. It's just that so that begs the question, imagine if all these universities and NGOs and foundations and think tanks and fact checkers were in the control of your political opponents. What would they label as conspiracy theories? What would they label as disinformation? That's the important question you need to answer, because I don't think you'll like the answer. So we go down this route of immediately, criminalizing or knocking things offline for being disinformation or conspiracy, then we are entering really dangerous territory indeed. So I think we need to find a way to tackle the real instances of disinformation, the real, crazy belief systems that some people are adopting that in some cases might lead them to violence, but without bringing in everybody's political opponents and kind of political axes to grind into this. And at the moment, I don't see that happening. So I think that's something we really need to do. Brilliant.
Thank you, Lynn. So much there that we could kick around for the rest of the hour. But I'm going to bring Nama Kate straight in. Now, what's your perspective on this? And fascinated from the perspective of the work that brilliant work that you've done, trying to get people focusing on incels and how incels are perceived and how they perceive themselves in a different way to where again a lot of this debate goes. Over to you.
Thank you. Afternoon. It's an honor to speak to you all on this topic. I talk to incels. Some say I platform them for their beliefs. More importantly, I listen to them. Each week I produce a podcast about this fringe group of sexless men and the issues that plague them. Involuntary celibates, not to be confused with monks, are not a godly bunch. They've been linked to several mass murders or acts of domestic terrorism in North America over the past 5 years, and I think a few thwarted attempts in the UK, so good work on that. Sometimes that link is pretty flimsy, but that's another issue. They're known for their odious misogynistic beliefs, their memes, their catchy neologisms. I'm often asked why incels. All I know is that once I bit into the apple of those forums, I couldn't look away. It struck a nerve with me and with my audience, and it strikes a nerve with you too, if you're asking the question. The driving ideology of the incelosphere is called the black pill. It's a derivative of the alt-right's red pill, itself a concept from the film The Matrix, where the protagonist, Neo, is given a choice. Take the blue pill and remain in blissful ignorance, or take the red pill and discover the harsh truth. So the latter choice is bolder, braver, it'll set you free. The scientific black pill, as it's known, is comprised of a series of peer-reviewed studies that paint a very bleak and myopic picture of human behavior. It's taboo, it's dark, it's offensive, some of it is terrible science, and it's irresistible to a lot of people. Conspiracy theories have been around for centuries. They satisfy the yearning of a restless mind to find patterns and randomness, validate one's own frustrations, justify one's own wretchedness, and blame it all on something outside one's own control, some secret club, all the while giving entree into just such a club with those who know the hidden truth. That's the psychology as far as I understand it, the initial appeal for a certain kind of person, someone who's a little oppositional, intellectually curious, and aggrieved in some way. Over the past few years and the course of my research, I've talked to hundreds of incels, mostly just parishioners with varying degrees of piety, but some preachers too. They congregate exclusively online, on the open web, or platforms like Reddit, Discord, and YouTube. The administrators of their most popular forum, which is the subject of a lot of data scraping for academic inquiry, currently at incels.is, but the domain keeps changing because it gets banned and seized. They're frequent guests on my show, and I find them reasonable and smart, actually, people that you could work with. They started the forum in 2017 in the immediate aftermath of a Reddit ban on the original r/incels community. Between then and now, Reddit has summarily banned at least a dozen incel communities as they come up for hate speech, including one recently called r/incels without hate, which committed not to include hate speech. These bans result in mass migrations, a lot of new members for that forum. I used to marvel at the gross mischaracterization of media and the academy that incels are a gateway to the far right. And I think I was right too. The average incel is just kind of a frustrated kid who overthinks things and has some very legitimate grievances, actually, about an increasingly narcissistic, superficial, and materialistic society. And they often find solace in this space and then outgrow it. But now, I don't know. I am beginning to see them grow more political and more antagonistic. The old timers tell me about how much the place has changed. How the original r/incels was so much lighter, more positive, and more heterodox. In our first interview, Sergeant Incel, the founder and quasi-dictator of the forum, told me why he liked that r/incels community. It was blunt, it was honest. He said, if a guy complained that he couldn't get a date, people would ask, how tall are you? And if he said 5'2", they'd simply tell him you're too short, instead of you need to try harder. Most incels echo this sentiment, and I get it. Our polite society is tragically blue-pilled. We're afraid to speak the truth. We don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. That's nice and often appropriate. But the inherent dishonesty of censorship leads to a logical fallacy. If sometimes the truth is so ugly a thing we dare not say it at all, then maybe everything we dare not say, all those ugly things, are the truth. Censorship is counterproductive, in my opinion. It's a cosmetic solution that removes the brunt of responsibility off the shoulders of big tech. Limited exposure will appear to result in a decrease in total numbers as the moderating voices are kept out, but the most desperate and fanatical will always find a way in. Because these people, this community, it doesn't just disappear. It reemerges in the dark, re-energized, reimagined, its greatest fears of persecution now confirmed, and it turns into something much harder to defend. In its current form, the incel ideology does not call for violence in any way, but as their meat spaces are limited to those shared with other outcasts, like, for example, the extreme far-right groups, the ideologies inevitably begin to blend. They feed off each other because no one else is listening. They're dehumanized and nobody cares, and nothing's left to lose. And only then does violence become a viable option. And that's where we're headed if we take honest discussion off the table. Another question I've been asked a lot is why they talk to me. You know, what do they get out of it? They must be using you to spread their message or to recruit. This childish interpretation comes from surprisingly sophisticated people who can't possibly be listening to the actual interviews that are, with few exceptions, raw and honest and sad and profound. The answer is obvious. They want to connect and to be heard outside of their echo chamber. Most people do. I don't have empirical data to prove that the podcast, which facilitates this dialogue between incels and the listeners, is a net good, but I have so many stories, success stories even, of incels who've made friendships, gained confidence, even started therapy or dating. There's hope yet if they're willing to talk and if we're willing to listen. Honest discussion must continue. So thank you all again for inviting me to this one. You're muted. I can't hear you.
So sorry, I'm muted because my my small yappy type dog has just met my mum's small yappy type dog and cue much yapping. So I thought I could mute myself and ended up with this. Look, thank you. That was fascinating. Let me bring Aaron straight in. I should ask now, whereabouts in the States are you dialing in from right now? Where are you?
I'm in DC.
Aaron.
Oh, sorry. Who were you asking?
Well, I was asking now, but I was going to ask you. I was going to guess that you were in DC, given the title of the publication. So yeah, look. Thank you, Aaron. Let's what are your perspectives on this and what is happening over in the States at the moment?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. There's a lot I could say, so I'm going to try to kind of restrict my remarks. But first, I want to just talk a little about what disinformation is, and then I want to talk about one particular way in which I think the obsession with disinformation is harmful and dangerous. It seems to me that disinformation is always defined in opposition to some expert consensus. What is false, or more often what is misleading, is determined by a judgment about what is true or what is the whole story. And who determines what's true in the whole story? Usually it's some body of experts that anti-disinformation activists also often appeal to. And there's two problems with this. The first, which I think some people have already touched on and people will probably get to more in the Q&A, is that sometimes there just isn't really a meaningful expert consensus, but there are activists who feel very strongly about something. And so they end up kind of finding like-minded experts, perhaps we should put experts in air quotes, and kind of laundering their agenda as impartial expertise and sort of manufacturing an expert consensus that doesn't really exist. And that's how disinformation, defined again in opposition to that fake consensus, can be weaponized for political ends. And that's obviously very harmful, but I think there's a bigger problem, and this is what I want to focus on, which is that there are cases of genuine expert agreement where, you know, poll all the experts in a given field, they will all have some, you know, they'll mostly agree on what's true or not. Problem is that that expert consensus can be wrong, very wrong, even on sort of technical or technocratic questions. And in those cases, if you censor disinformation, again, defined as anyone who dissents from the consensus, that can have real epistemic and even human costs. And since, you know, we don't have much time, I just want to restrict it to one kind of case study, and that's the coronavirus, where the conventional wisdom among experts shifted very radically, very quickly at so many points throughout the pandemic that if opposition to the expert consensus, you know, was systematically censored, I think, as bad as the crisis was in much of the West, we would have been far worse off if dissidents and even cranks hadn't been allowed to speak their mind about COVID. So let me just run through a few examples of where the expert consensus was disastrously wrong. And for each one, bear in mind that if you spoke out against the consensus, you would often be accused of spreading disinformation. And that there are people who want to censor your ability to spread quote unquote disinformation online. Mm-hmm. The first and most obvious case is that in January and for much of February, most experts in the West, especially the United States, believed that the coronavirus was not that big a deal, was probably not that much of a flu, was not much worse than the flu. If you disagreed, the experts often implied or said outright, you're being irrational and perhaps even racist. In the US, there was this idea that, you know, if you were worried about a virus from China, it was motivated by anti-Chinese racism, not the fact that China was, you know, welding people in their doors to try to contain a deadly virus. And, you know, I think that the failure of the media and the general public health community to take it seriously early on probably meant that we were not as well prepared as we could have been. But, you know, imagine if those kind of cranks and dissenters, the weird online anonymous accounts who are raising the alarm from China, imagine if they had been censored. Even more people would have been unprepared, and the pandemic would have come as even more of a shock, and the lack of preparedness could have resulted in even more people dying. I think that's the most obvious case, but there's others. For about a month in the United States, even once it became clear this was going to be a big deal, people were told not to wear masks because masks didn't work and in fact might facilitate the spread of the virus because people weren't educated enough to put them on correctly. Well, it turns out that masks seem to work. And not only that, but a lot of the things we were told to do, like washing our hands, you know, and just staying 6 feet apart, at least indoors, probably made almost no difference because a lot of the virus, a lot of transmission is aerosols. And that's not what the World Health Organization or many other experts, including the CDC, said at first. So again, if you dissented on, you know, how the virus was spread or whether masks worked, you know, you could be saving lives because it turns out that you were probably correct. But for about a month, that was seen as a kind of disinformation. There's a few other examples I'll just go through. Experts in the US said that the vaccine couldn't be developed and distributed widely by April. It was. That one, I think, was partly motivated by kind of anti-Trump animus because Trump promised that and then people said, oh, it couldn't be done, and then it was. In the United Kingdom, where many of you are, experts in The Guardian, there was this report that said that Brexit was going to screw over the UK on vaccine procurement, and that the EU would use its superior purchasing power to get first dibs on the vaccine, and so Britain was going to be behind. Well, the exact opposite happened. The EU really screwed it up, and being outside of the EU arguably is the reason that Britain's epidemic is now plummeting, case counts are plummeting, and that's not happening to the same extent throughout Europe. Few other examples. A lot of experts claimed that it was necessary to pause the Johnson & Johnson vaccine after 6 in 7 million people reported rare blood clots, because if they didn't pause the vaccine, it would greatly increase vaccine hesitancy. Instead, the pause, as might have been predicted from the AstraZeneca debacle in Europe, increased vaccine hesitancy. And many people predicted this. But if you spoke up and said this, a lot of public health experts would say, well, you're not an expert, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, the public health experts who pushed the Johnson & Johnson pause now are confronting a steep decline in vaccine rates in the United States, which started almost exactly the day after the pause went into effect. There's other things. I think another big one is that experts systematically failed to predict which outbreaks would be worse. In the United States, it was argued that red states would do very badly. People at The Atlantic ran a headline saying that Georgia was running an experiment in human sacrifice when it relaxed a lot of its restrictions. Turns out that Georgia, Florida, and Texas all did about the same, and in some cases better than many blue states, despite having fewer restrictions. And what I think all of this should tell you is not that we don't need experts, and not that disinformation can't exist or anything like that, but that the people who are going to be determining what disinformation is and when it should be censored have a really bad predictive track record on quite arguably the most important global crisis of the past at least 3 decades and arguably half century. Think about how many lives some of those errors, like the Johnson & Johnson vaccine pause, likely cost. There are probably people who are dead today who wouldn't be dead if they hadn't paused the vaccine. And now imagine if dissent from those experts had been systematically censored, maybe by the government, or more likely by, say, Jack Dorsey or some algorithm in Silicon Valley. I think it's plausible that more people would be dead. And so, it's often this debate is had, as sort of in terms of, is disinformation going to be weaponized for partisan ends? Yeah, that's a concern. But I think you don't even have to be worried about that to be worried that defining this huge category of claims as disinformation and suppressing them can in fact have incredible epistemic and human costs. And that's the main reason that I think we should be very skeptical of disinformation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Aaron. Profoundly challenging. I was indeed one of those people that predicted it would be a terrible thing if the UK was not part of the European Medicines Agency, and was indeed proved entirely wrong. There is again, several hours to discuss on this subject alone, but I'm going to we'll leave some time to get as much time at the end. I'm going to bring Dr. David Jeffery of lecturing British politics at Liverpool University. He's been particular focus on populism, which obviously is running right the way through this thread. What's your perspective on this, Dr. Jeffery?
Thank you. I think the core of my view is that we have a blind spot, as in the UK context, what I'm interested in here. We have a blind spot when we talk about things like disinformation and populism, and we can't really get to a position where we can have a cure if we're misdiagnosing the issue based on a lack of evidence or lack of a fully rounded perspective. So disinformation, since say the EU referendum, like Liam mentioned, has been primarily framed as a right-wing issue. It is, let's use some broad phrases that probably should be unpicked, but we don't have time. Kind of left behind voters who former Labour voters who voted to leave because they were hoodwinked by a bus, right? Or people who will believe any rubbish that Boris Johnson wrote in his Telegraph articles, and now they're being hoodwinked because he's seen as a man of the people, and can pull a pint in Wetherspoons, right? And we see it as a right-wing issue. There was some elements of this with Jeremy Corbyn where people kind of pushed back and said, well, actually, you're seeing some left-wing voters being hoodwinked by this man who's got quite distasteful views, to put it mildly. But by and large, it's seen as a right-wing issue, and it's seen as a right-wing English issue as well. So we see this when we talk about Brexit being an English nationalist project, which first of all ignores the fact that it got a majority in Wales and a significant proportion of votes in Scotland as well, and also maybe kind of more votes on the right, but also on the left. We see it being ignored in the way that kind of in the post-referendum era, the kind of, I'm using very broad brush phrases here to kind of, because I haven't got detailed demographic information, but let's call it the Remainer middle class on Twitter, who lapped up every Guardian article from Calderwolla, for instance, who has had to apologise in court because effectively there was no evidence for what she was saying, but these articles were being shared as the gospel truth. As a counter argument to the stupidity of Leave voters who were ensnared by nasty populism. We see this Scottish in the Scottish scene with independence voter, people who support independence rather, not believing objectively true facts about where money comes from that funds Scottish programs, and there's not much you can do there, because if you are showing people the correct figures and they refuse to believe it, there's nothing government can do, right? There's nothing you can do to fix that. And what we have though is we have a rhetoric or a discourse that focuses on it as a primarily right-wing issue when it's not. We find it across society from different political perspectives, but there seems to be a view that, and again I'm using this term loosely, the kind of the middle class or the kind of liberal left voter coalition could never be hoodwinked by these type of issues. It's only the kind of working class or left behind voters. And if we don't know what the problem is, then we can't get to a proper cure, right? And we also lead to this being weaponized as a kind of political football, which again undermines the kind of seriousness of the issue that the internet means that we can have more news at our fingertips than ever before, but the erosion of traditional gatekeepers also means that we can have more fake news at our fingertips than ever before. And these are clearly two kind of sides of the same coin, right? The internet doesn't just bring choice in good things, it brings choice in bad things as well, and variety on both sides. So what would a response look like? So this, I'm drawing somewhat on some of the literature on populism and how traditional parties are seen to respond to populism, right? So we're kind of past the point now where we see populism as a problem that you need to remove from your political system, right? It is a political ideology like any other, in the sense that it is held by a range of different people who are united, kind of having shared understandings of how they see power, how they see their own political community, how they see the role of mediating institutions, in the same way that it would almost be nonsensical for us to worry about having liberals in society or socialists or conservatives. Populism is just a different type of ideology that never really used to be as politically salient as it is now, but times change. In the same way, environmentalism never used to be politically salient. And as we all know, you can't ban an ideology. It just does not work. So what would a response look like to fake news, say, or to disinformation? Because again, we see that in some contexts, populism can actually be quite a good thing. So in authoritarian regimes, having political actors who say we should respect the will of the people, we should give people a greater say in decision-making powers, we should remove barriers to stop what people think from being enacted. It's quite good, right? You probably want people standing up for that type of belief if you live in a dictatorship. North Korea would benefit from a lot more populists, essentially. Populism's less good when you're in a liberal democracy and it's the courts now that are seen as blocking the will of the people, or it is due process, or it is parliament. That's when populism can be quite bad. And we see examples of this perhaps in Ecuador under Evo Morales. We obviously saw it in Venezuela under Chavez. And obviously there's lots of right-wing examples we can choose from across Europe as well. But I like to use the left-wing examples because it reminds people that it's on both sides of the spectrum. But a response, I'm quite torn about this, because I think we look at platforms like Facebook and Twitter and say they shouldn't ban people who say things that we don't like. But I think they're not public companies. They are private platforms that have their own right to have who they want and who they don't want on their own platform. And it is almost just as bad to say you have to host this speech, to say you can't host this speech. But I think in the long run, it is a bad idea for Facebook and Twitter to eagerly deplatform people for having ideas that are not explicitly dangerous and that are not explicitly incitement. Because we know that it can work, right? We did have President Trump saying things on Twitter that were generally, I mean, to my view anyway, generally unpleasant, but not inciting violence. And this seemed to have changed, right? This materially changed in January. And then I think it is right that social media companies do have a responsibility to stop it then. But the issue was, and the real issue with online censorship, is that the rationale and the framework within which this happens is never consistent. So we can have the Iranian Ayatollah threatening damnation on the West, and Twitter's like, oh, that's, well, you know, he's an official, right? We can't get rid of him. But then Trump does something much less. He doesn't threaten nuclear war in America, but you know, he does things bad, and he's gone. So no wonder people then believe that this is a Silicon Valley liberal stitch-up, because the rules aren't applied consistently. And I don't claim to be an expert on tech. I don't claim to be an expert on how to build an ideal society, but I do think one of the best things liberal society can show is the rule of law. And I think that would be a very good place for Twitter and Facebook to start, because if you can be consistent, studies have shown that if Facebook takes the time to explain to people why posts are removed or why people get censored, they then come back and they're more likely to work within the rules. Whereas if it seems to be arbitrary, then people feel victimized. And then I think the final point I'd like to make is that it's also unsurprising that people are more skeptical of the media now, or people seem to be more skeptical of the media when the amount of volume of news content required because of the internet has shot up. And this means that, we have a lot of tat essentially posing as news, but also that we do things that I think I've been guilty of helping to provide: expert prediction. That is not news, but it's presented as news. And maybe Michael Gove wasn't right when he said that people have had enough of experts, but they've certainly had enough of experts' opinions, because as we know, having a PhD, as everybody who knows me will say, having a PhD does not mean your opinions are right, or that you are not wrong almost consistently. So the issue is that we treat experts as Aaron was mentioning, as kind of as angels, right? Who are who cannot be wrong. But what we don't do is question the underlying assumptions, even with their models, right? We don't. When we say Brexit will harm exports to this extent, the assumptions underpinning those models are never unpicked. And I think that would also, if you show your working to the public, they're much less likely to be so suspicious when they do have news that perhaps doesn't chime with their experiences.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thank you, David. Let me just bring Nama and Aaron straight in on what you were particularly on what you were saying on Facebook and Twitter and Donald Trump, and would you have banned him? I mean, I'm guessing both of you. So, Nama first, you would say that it was a mistake for Twitter to have done that. What do you think?
Yeah, I do think it was a mistake. I mean, it really, when you're talking about a group of people that comprises almost half of the population that were Trump supporters, to ban someone, especially while he was still sitting president. I mean, I get, it really does lead to increased distrust. And we saw other platforms like Gab and Parler. Obviously, you know, that came down rather quickly, but the membership was, you know, overnight, it just skyrocketed. And so these platforms, they become echo chambers and silos. And then you have everybody that's on the right only in their echo chamber. And that, you know, it just leads to further polarization, which is what we're seeing here and everywhere now.
I can really take that point of polarization. I'm not sure though, and Aaron, what do you think in terms of the numbers on this? Is there not? I mean, there is a question of whether it is the right long-term strategy to restrict the oxygen for particular perspectives by banning them or turning them down from popular popular mainstream social media as it become. But it is the case, is it not, Aaron, that it is effective still at the moment to take these people or these views off Facebook, for example,
Yeah,
and put them in somewhere else. I mean, yes, you've got a less easily monitored social media environment, but it is a much smaller one that can.
yeah, I think that's
where the sorry.
Oh, no. Oh, you go ahead if you want.
Oh, well, just that smaller one is where the sort of extremism really grows. It is smaller, but it's more committed.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So I think we need to kind of distinguish between, you know, two claims. Like I think it works it does not work if your goal is to just destroy the ideology, because as Noma says, then the people just go into these smaller networks and it becomes a self-reinforcing echo chamber. But yeah, I do agree with you that it is effective at denying people a platform. It does limit the spread, at least in the short term. And that's precisely the problem and the reason I think it's very dangerous. You'll hear this argument where people will say in the US, well, you know, okay, yeah, they banned him from Twitter and Facebook and Parler and Gab and YouTube, and they list like basically every online media platform and say, but you know, he can still call into Fox News, so he still has a platform. It's like, yes, he still has a platform, but the problem is that he now has fewer platforms than other people who aren't banned. And so what they're doing, they're not preventing him from speaking, but what they are doing is they're creating an asymmetry in which people can kind of the reach that different teams, so to speak, have, right? If you're in Facebook and Twitter's good graces, you can avail yourself of that technology to reach people around the world. And if you're not, you can't. So like, yes, Trump can still call into Fox News and reach his base, great. But, you know, when you deny Trump that platform, you are materially reducing his power relative to all the people who aren't banned.
And you think that's profoundly problematic, given that he did achieve elected office?
Yeah, I think that's problematic. But, you know, I would also just say, so like, look, I tend to agree that it was a mistake to ban him. I also think that he deranged that website, and I can't say that I miss him really. Like it might have been better for sort of the just culture of debate for him to be gone. But, you know, like Trump's also not the biggest issue here. The issue is that there's a bunch of other people who, you know, might get banned, right? Like, you know, I mean, the hate speech policies are perhaps even more concerning than the disinformation ones. Like, you know, what's hate speech? Is hate speech? I mean, if it is literally, you know, saying that like one race is inferior to another, okay, that's pretty clear cut. If wanting less immigration is hate speech, well, then you just basically kicked off from Twitter, like, you know, half the United States. I mean, and that's the concern, I think.
If saying biological sex is real is hate
yeah,
speech in the eyes
and like there are people who genuinely believe that, and some of those people do work at Twitter. I mean, I think that's a real problem.
Yeah, because I mean, this leads into one of the things I was going to pick up from what you said, David, on yes, when you frame the debate about Twitter and Facebook to say, well, look, they are private organizations, they can decide who's, and you sort of nod along to that, but then you also nod along to when they say, but look, but these platforms have become in such a short space of time so pervasive that actually you're getting a very narrow group of people who are deciding what should and shouldn't be said on those platforms. And just to roll in my other, really big question from the beginning, it is a grade A problem, is it not? Or tell me if I think Liam was maybe close to saying I'm over worrying about it, but I'm still clinging to that it is a grade A problem that you get such a large proportion of the most powerful democracy in the world believing something which is a fantasy, and that it was at least, well, discuss how big a factor it was, but it was at least a factor in the political violence which happened on the 6th of January. And if it is my job to look at, how you reduce instances of political violence in liberal democracies like the United Kingdom, then that disinformation and how it was able to grow should really be part of my thinking, should it not?
I think if we were having this debate 15 years ago, we'd have been saying MySpace is too big. It is almost a public square now and it should be regulated there. And then Facebook and Twitter have come along. We have Instagram. I guess that's part of Facebook now. We have lots of, and the point is that actually the thing that these companies are trading off are the benefits of network effects. Twitter is completely valueless if there's nobody on there. And this leads to the next step, that what the role of government in this, and in my opinion, is regulation about what is acceptable and what isn't. So in the sense that it has to be applied consistently. And I think actually, I can't remember who made this point before, but the fact that Trump being president meant Twitter shouldn't have banned him. Well, I think the reverse is true. Because he's president, he should be subject to the same rules and regulations as everybody else on that platform, because ultimately he's only won an election in America. He's not won an election anywhere else. There's no reason why he should be able to have a platform to everyone else. But we actually have a way for politicians to communicate with voters. That's political parties, right? They did a grand job for the last 200 years. It's not as if that asymmetry, as Zaran put it, is a problem, because there are asymmetries embedded. I've got 7,000 followers on Twitter. That's an asymmetry, right? Like, I don't have the reach of Trump. That's not really affecting my free speech. He's been elected though. So what, right? Okay, so's my local councillor. It doesn't mean that he has a right to access a private platform and say whatever he wants, which have real world consequences. In fact, he should be held to a higher standard than some anonymous account with 21 followers and spewing out stupid things. So I think the issue, there's two issues here. One is that these politicians, say in the case of Trump, but I think Trump is an edge case and is probably not where the most useful discussion lies. But if we have communities on Twitter and on Facebook where you can get this type of hate rising, well, it is clear that what Trump said had real world consequences, and it is probably clear that there are less palatable political actors in the world who say even worse things. The role of government should be to make sure that standards are being applied consistently and fairly within a framework that suits, within a framework that is not too onerous. Now, that's where political debate comes in about what should it be, right? Should being able to deny the reality of biological sex be a reason to be kicked off or not? Well, that's politics, right? That's where that comes in. But the content is kind of separate to how you would moderate. The content of what that moderation should look like is different from what the system should be.
Got you. Let me bring Liam. What do you think to that? And what do you think to my main? I mean, am I just over worrying about disinformation as a factor in political violence, and then everyone potentially moving off and going off into whatever the new parlor is, which is totally unregulated and will not take no for an answer?
I have a really messy opinion on this, and I agree with David that Trump's a bit of a red herring on this subject, and it's not actually that productive to talk about him. That said, I do actually think he did enough to get booted off the platform in January. I think you're right. I think I have a really pessimistic view of the impact of social media at kind of civilizational scale. I don't think it's. I think in many ways it's been really good, and I used to say that people were just panicking about social media, but actually I think it has had a lot of negative impacts as well, and not just in the traditional cliche ways that everybody says about echo chambers and silos and things like that. I'm just very skeptical of the solutions, which is obviously why we're talking today. And I think I don't buy the Amazon or YouTube or whatever are private platforms argument. I think they're so powerful now and such an integral part of public debate that they are the public square now. So I think there should be a lot more due process and a lot more transparency around removal of information and people. That isn't happening now because the kind of expert and liberal consensus kind of agrees with the people that it's being targeted at. But that could, the wind could change on that overnight, and we need to be really conscious of it. In terms of your broader point about the impact of this on violence, I think it definitely can play a role, but it can also play a role across the political spectrum. So I think there was a survey recently, this is quite a controversial point, I'll admit, but there was a survey recently that said that liberals tend to think that US police kill over 1,000 unarmed non-whites every year. The real figure is 12 or 13 or something like that. So in what way is that not misinformation or a conspiracy theory? And that has actually led to quite a lot of unrest in the streets. And even in the UK, we had people saying hands up, don't shoot at British police officers who don't carry guns. So in what way does that make sense? Do you see what I'm getting at? Yeah. I think that, and I'm not just saying that as a cheap political point, by the way. I'm just saying, when the wind blows, we won't like what we've unleashed in this disinformation censorship argument. Right. But I think my broader argument is, yes, disinformation can play a role, but I still think, and call me a Marxist if you will, but I still think there are materialistic reasons for the discontent, for the dissatisfaction, for the distrust that we're seeing. COVID is a part of it. There's huge uncertainty around COVID, but there's look across Europe, unemployment rates among youth are 30 to 40%. Inequality is soaring. These are factors that are not going to be solved by booting Alex Jones or Milo Yiannopoulos offline. I think there's real contributing factors to violence and unrest, and we need to think about that as well.
Now we're at 5 p.m., which was the advertised stop time for this. I wanted to ask if the panelists would consider a hard stop. I will not take us past 5:15. I mean, actually, whatever the time is, another 15 minutes. I only realise there's a totally different time zones that many of you are in. Are you okay for hanging on for another?
Yeah, that's great.
I will not let it go beyond 5:15 UK time. Wonderful. Well, question from one of the people who've tuned in, Russell Milliken, about the new right in Germany trying to influence public debate in more subtle ways than in the past. And if any of you have a perspective on that, and there is a wider, the German example brings in a wider question. I mean, David, you said you can't ban ideologies. Well, I mean, there are instances where there are attempts to ban ideologies, and Nazism and fascism within Germany is an example of that. And I'm interested in the way in Germany where there is a more holistic, certainly stated attempt by the state to protect the constitution and democracy. And I wonder whether that has anything to teach the UK or not. Discuss.
Yes, I think, I mean, in terms of that, yeah, you're right about liberal democracies. Well, the UK doesn't really do it. It's much, but it is, I think anyway, from a liberal, a small L liberal perspective, it is completely acceptable to pass legislation to protect the rules of constitutional democracy, because you just can't. You can't bring liberal democratic norms when your enemies are bringing guns. to a fight, right? You can't fight a coup with an idea in the immediate moment. So yes, it's completely fine to do things like that. But I mean, this talk of new right through, I mean, Gramsci was talking about the long march through the institutions from prison, right? It's talking about that's how, you know, we'll shift the Overton window of what's acceptable. The public sphere is where these ideologies get contested. I don't see that as much of a problem, because as long as your recruitment methods, and again, this is a role for small and liberal states, are free from selection on political lines, then it's less of an issue. I mean, I personally think we have an issue, say, within our higher education system, whereby there are a certain range of views that are not permissible, some in a very formal sense and some in a more softy sense. And I'm speaking as someone who has perhaps suffered from some of that to some extent. But when I said you couldn't ban an idea, I think in the sense of people believing conspiracy theory, you can't, for example, on Liam's example of polling that shows people thinking about what the police do, you obviously can't ban that type of ideology. It's kind of pertinent to what we're talking about now.
Aaron, look, in terms of banning deprioritizing opinion, I thought it was really interesting the example that you give on the ways in which actually the prevailing wisdom over COVID has changed, and you put all of the examples you gave are verifiably ones where it did change. However, I mean, you gave the example at the end about vaccine skepticism having increased. Is there not a valid? Is there still not a valid response in trying to manage the way in which particular distorting ideas are emphasized and de-emphasized in a way that if you had stepped back from that activity across the range of media, social media channels, then actually the success that you see in the UK, for example, where actually there has been a much greater take up of the vaccine than anyone was predicting, really, in the mainstream predictions. That is still partly of having exercised the kind of techniques which you were saying that we should be skeptical of.
Yeah, so you know, I don't know as much about how the UK has handled sort of quote unquote misinformation about vaccines, but I'll just make a couple remarks, which is yeah, so vaccine hesitancy is a problem. On the other hand, you know, let's say that there was some real, I mean, I don't believe this, but let's say that there was actually some like real risk that the Pfizer vaccine actually, I don't know, like made people go sterile. And, you know, it was at first only cranks saying it, but it turned out actually to be true, or at least, you know, not the kind of thing you can just outright dismiss as false. I think then we'd have a very, you know, then it would be pretty concerning if the government started, you know, censoring that because they wanted everyone to get the vaccine. But, and then, you know, say in like 20 years, everyone gets the vaccine, but like you have a giant fertility crisis. I mean, I don't think that's likely, but just you can play all these games, right? Where once you start saying, well, maybe the consequences of the misinformation are so great, you can just as easily say, yeah, but like the consequences of censoring something that you think is misinformation, but actually isn't, could be just as great. And so I'm skeptical of our ability to really assess those trade-offs with any degree of precision. Mm-hmm. I guess the other thing, though, I would say on COVID is I think America's free speech jurisprudence is somewhat different than Europe's. It's more robust and more skeptical of things like hate speech. And, you know, I know in Australia, there were people who were arrested for posting about anti-lockdown protests on Facebook. And I have heard, and again, you know, I'm not in the UK, so it could be that this is misreported, but I've heard stories that sound kind of like that coming out of the UK. Mm-hmm. And given how much debate there is about whether lockdowns work or whether the costs are worth it, that's pretty terrifying to me that, you know, you could plausibly have that happen. And so like, yeah, the vaccine thing is a tough case. But, you know, if the price of getting rid of that is that people who post, anti-lockdown stuff are like visited by the police, I'm inclined to say probably that, it may just be a necessary price we pay. And then the last point I would make on this too is just a lot of the whole premise of this debate often is that misinformation is like a causal driver of behavior, and no doubt it can be, but often I think culture can be the driver of misinformation, and the disinformation's like actual consequences for behavior I think are more marginal. And the vaccine thing is a good example where I suspect a lot of the hesitancy is not based in anyone really believing that it's going to kill them or whatever. I think a lot of it has become kind of a culture war. And so then, if you're on one side of the culture war, you maybe find studies or cherry pick Twitter accounts that seem to confirm that the vaccines are bad. But I don't really think it's that like people heard something on Twitter and think, oh crap, I'm going to die if I take the vaccine. I think it's much more like a deeper skepticism of the establishment, as kind of Liam was getting at earlier. And the best way to solve things like vaccine hesitancy is to have an establishment that just commands more respect because it performs better than it has.
Which, and with the big cases say that in the UK, the vaccine, the NHS and the government and the vaccine establishment has kind of done that. No,
I think that's true.
No, to go back to your introductory remarks on incels, I mean, would you seem to be suggesting that actually we should have the discussion around the concerns of incels should not be marginalized in the way that it has been, and actually we would all benefit if these kind of discussions and were more a greater part of mainstream debate. That's what you think?
Yeah, absolutely I do, because although it's unpopular to say, to some degree the grievances are legitimate, and to some degree these people are marginalized, just in the sense that they're often they were bullied or picked on. And now I agree with Liam that social media has been sort of terrible and disastrous for us all. Add online dating to that, and people sort of interacting on the basis of a little photoshopped picture and a very curated sort of image of themselves. So people that don't fit into whatever is sort of considered socially acceptable or fashionable or chic are kind of left out even more. They get more marginalized. I'm sympathetic to that position. And just from everything that I know from doing this, it was initially not a hateful group. It started as, a community that was called Love Shy, Forever Alone, people that were lonely and were talking about loneliness and why. And as the media narrative turned into, these are terrorists, and this is the boogeyman, and this is the angry young white man living in his mother's basement loser. Well, that's really fueled, it's really made the nature of the rhetoric more extreme and more angry, as it does, when people are treated worse and antagonized more, and social media encourages this too, they will, assume the position. That's how it happens,
So we should just basically all be nicer to each other. And
yes, yes, of course, we should.
Everything should be just like LinkedIn, but you're just not allowed to be like to explain. No, that's probably going. That's not going to happen. Look, I just want to thank you all again for what you brought to this debate. Obviously, in the UK, in the US, this is going to rage on, and there are. I think it's really interesting that the UK's defense strategy at the moment is placing disinformation from hostile states as a significant part of the things which it should be, which it needs to do more to build up a narrative to counter. But what I think the points that you've all brought to this discussion, it just reminds us actually that this is not while yes, I mean you can say that it's really important to do more on this, and I'm amongst those in believing that. But this is not a thing which external people do to us citizens of the UK and the US. This is very much an internal domestic issue, and that that many of the much of the received wisdom in terms of the direction that political parties want to take this actually may well have some pretty profound consequences, both in terms of what liberal democracies are about, but also in unintended consequences in dealing with the actual problems of political violence and extremism, which we have, which they are purported to be there to fix. So I feel if we just had an extra 15 minutes, we might have been able to solve this, but unfortunately, I'm going to bring it to a close there. Thank you all for what you've contributed, and this discussion will be available. People have tuned in live onto it now. It will be available on YouTube, and I hope it gives many more people some food for thought as we try to get into a better place on these issues in the months and years and probably decades ahead. So thank you all for your contribution. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and thank you of course to the Counter-Extremism Project, Mary-Kate and Liam, for having brought us together to have this discussion. Really valuable. Thank you all. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks all. It's good fun.
Good morning. Good day over there.